The Fantasy Animation Podcast is a completely independent production. It is made by experts in the field. Chris is a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London and author of The Computer Animated Film, available in all good bookshops. And I, Alex that is, am a senior lecturer in film and media studies at the University of Portsmouth and author of Encountering the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema, available in even better bookshops. We do this podcast to provide audiences with an informative and hopefully entertaining guide through the ways in which you can not only enjoy fantasy and animation, but study it, examine it, explore it, and of course, make it and have a career in it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I am Chris Holliday.
Chris, we made it to the end of the trilogy. Thank you for bearing through it with me. We are at the final instalment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Return of the King.
Yep.
It only took us probably about the same amount of time as it took to make the movies to get through them all.
Yeah, well, I had a little joke written down, which was we finished a trilogy we started a couple of years ago, at least.
Yes.
And then I put in brackets, to be fair, we've only just finished watching them.
Yes.
And we didn't even watch the extended editions or whatever version we watched. We watched a 3-hour Behemoth.
I thought you had suffered enough to put you through that.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Good. Well, yes. So we're going to do an episode about the Return of the King now. The final instalment. We're going to sort of use it as an opportunity to kind of see if there's anything about the Lord of the Rings we haven't spoken about in our previous episodes, and listeners should go back perhaps and listen to our previous episodes if you want to hear everything we've said up until this point. There's an episode on The Fellowship way back in the archive somewhere. There's an episode from Two Towers from about a year ago, and we're going to try between the two of us and unpack this very lengthy film, but also kind of use it as a way of, I don't know, saying goodbye to the trilogy, of which I basically started a podcast with you so that to make you watch. So I've done it now. My work is done.
Yeah. No, as I said, I find it quite difficult to keep track of the characters in these films, but it is nice to, and the completist in me wanted to finish this trilogy, and as you say, we've done it in slightly different ways with different people. Thinking about music, thinking about kind of Tolkien, I guess, in himself, fandom. Yeah. So this is perhaps an opportunity to pull out some things, certainly in relation to the films, the film in relation to something like visual effects and motion capture and so forth, and anti-Serkis. And so, I'm excited to talk about it. I'm not entirely sure I won't do its justice because I'm still processing, and you had to give me very nicely. You had to give me a sort of 10-minute seminar. I had an office hour with you before the episode started, before the screening started, I should say, where you sort of very nicely went through some of the characters and some of the events that had happened in the two films up to this point, and that really helped because we sat and have just watched it for so this is the 3-hour version, which isn't, I mean, it's long, but it's not the longest that exists.
There are these extended versions out there, but this is the theatrical cut.
Yep. And I sat there. I sat there. Enthralled, didn't move, didn't nip to the loo as I thought I was going to do. So I really enjoyed it. There are things that I think when I stopped the DVD and you said something like too many endings ? That was going to be my first. It sort of ends about 5 or 6 times, but we can talk about that. It'd be interesting to go through the plot to see if we can, and by we I mean you. And as I said, put out some things with regards to kind of Serkis and space and camera work. I thought was quite interesting, and location. And I asked you during the film, have you been to New Zealand? And I think I mentioned this previous. I have, and it looks exactly like it does in the films, and which is great and wonderful. So I guess we can start. Well, my this is the third of the trilogy, so I actually had an opening question, which is what this is the third and final. Well, at that point, the third and final in Lord of the Rings. How is this film? Whatever, how many years on? 20 years on, something like this.
Yeah.
What is it? Is it the good one? Is it the not as good as the second one? Is it not quite as good as the? I don't really know what the mythology around this third film is.
So it's an interesting one, this, because I would argue it is probably the most influential.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that, and maybe this is me retrospectively looking at it back at now, but there's two reasons why. One, at the time, this is the one that won all the Academy Awards. So this is the one that tied with Titanic, and is it Gone with the Wind or All About Eve for the 11th Oscar record?
Okay.
It's the one where Jackson wins Best Director, they win Best Picture, and he stands up on the stage and delivers this speech at the Oscars and says, "I'm just so proud that that fantasy is finally being recognised. It's finally not an F word that the Academy have to do a 5-second delay with." He makes this kind of gag speech. So it's the first fantasy film to ever win an Academy Award. So it's influential in that sense. Yeah,
So industrially, culturally.
Yeah, this is the one. But even at the time, that was seen very much as a nod to the achievement of the trilogy rather than this particular movie.
It's Scent of a Woman. It's not The Godfather.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. And
I've seen none of those films.
Whilst I think this film's still very successful in many ways, and hopefully we'll talk about that, I think it is the most influential in a bad way, in the sense that it is the most third act Marvel-y of them all. It's the most CG-tastic. It's the most cave troll battling, eagle battling, goblin battling, dragon-tastic. And I would say the least successful of the three, but there's a high bar that I would hold all of them to. What I would say is this one does has, and you've already alluded to when you were talking about it, is it has that sense of epicness.
It really does.
That the others kind of just do because of the length, but this one really feels like an epic. I'm reminded of kind of Sobchak's writing on the epic, and part of the epic is this kind of phenomenological endurance, right? It's a film. The pleasure of it is to endure it and to sit through it and to have all of this stuff take place in one sitting with you. So I think it has that quality. So I think the film's. I really like it, but it's probably the Lord of the Rings film I've seen the least. Because I think I prefer the other two, kind of just by personal taste.
Yeah, I've seen them all equally.
Sure,
and that is once.
Okay, fine.
But yes, so I thought having to do a bit of thinking and revision before the film started, I did really like it. I thought the set pieces were great because there's a lot of them. The plot is, and we can get to the plot, and by again we, I mean you can get to the plot. Not a lot happens, but it feels like there's lots of different kind of buddy movies that are happening simultaneously that need to, and you know, there's the Ocean's 11 narrative over there, and then the buddy cop movie over there, and then so there's lots of these different sort of ensemble pieces happening, and the film does quite a good job of bringing them all together. I think the knock-on effect of that is that each of those then needs an ending, and the film then gives us endings to narrative arcs that I guess in real time the audiences, if they hadn't read the book, would have been like, well, that's 2 years ago trying to plot something. For me, it was longer. So there's a bit of that sort of stuff. But I really liked the way that it looked. I thought some of the battle sequences were fantastic. I think one of the spider sequence, kind of spidery sequence, I thought was really great. Really, really great.
And that's often considered one of
the one of the battles, I can't remember which one of the half a dozen, where I think one side just steamrollers the other on horses. I was like, that's what I want from a battle. There's a lot of kind of combat, but actually that power. Maybe that's what I really liked about it. That innate sense of like, there's a lot of power behind the film, like real clout, and I really liked that. I think it was an appropriate ending. I'm trying to retrospectively think about what it would have been like in 2008, but it feels like a really important and very enjoyable kind of ending to a sort of brilliant trilogy.
Great.
Really.
Okay. Right.
What's going on with it, though?
So the plot. I mean, I'll do it as briefly as I can. So I think the key thing to say
Alex, take it long as you
an
want.
hour and then we're done. I think the key thing to say is that actually this is an adaptation of 1.5 books. It's not an adaptation of just one book. It is actually an adaptation of The Return of the King and basically one half of The Two Towers.
Right.
And we can get onto that because there's a lot of plot here. So essentially it's two things are going on at once. All our characters are split up based on the events of the last two movies, and roughly what we've got is two key plots going on. We've got Frodo, Sam and Gollum still on their way to Mordor, still on their way to Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring. Gollum's becoming increasingly dark and treacherous. He's trying to drive Sam and Frodo against one another.
Yep.
And we don't quite know what because it's not revealed, but there's something lurking round the corner on the journey that he's leading Frodo towards that we get will kind of lead him to his doom. So he's trying to take Sam, remove that position of trust that Sam has had in it, and then ultimately we're going to see if they destroy the One Ring. Spoiler alert, they do. And then the other, which involves the remaining of the fellowships, your Aragorns, Gollum, your Aragorns, your Legolasses, your Gimlis, the rest of the hobbits, all this sort of stuff, trying to defend the key human city of Minas Tirith, the capital of the Gondor, people of Gondor, from this huge assault from the armies of Mordor, of Sauron's orcs, essentially.
Yep.
So we have this massive battle between orcs and men, between the forces of Gondor and the forces of Mordor, playing out whilst Frodo, Sam, and Gollum try to destroy the One Ring.
Yeah, cool. So that kind of dual structure.
Yeah.
Very, very, very Hollywood musical, very Rick Altman dual-focused narrative. We won't
Love it.
But it did make me think of a split, just as you were talking, between kind of narrative and spectacle. And I wondered whether or not, because I really liked the Samwise Frodo Gollum sort of narrative element.
Yes.
That felt more like that's literally like two characters wrestling. Well, in some cases, physically wrestling with Gollum. That's like wrestling with fantasy. But that's kind of doing it through character, which I really liked. Kind of a character study of these three. It's very theatrical. I thought the three of them, all these different set pieces. Mm-hmm. The idea of treachery. I'm thinking of a lot of little plays where you have very small casts and two gang up on another one, or there is a kind of double cross, very kind of Harold Pinter, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I really liked that. So I wonder whether you had a kind of favourite. Just simply because I think one is very narrative and character based and story based, and one is very spectacle based and very sort of. Yeah, the power comes from that. So I just...
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think the Sam and Frodo stuff's really great.
Yeah, so
I think there are great moments in the other bit, but overall, that one is the most baggy, the most clunky, the most... characters become almost caricatures of themselves and all that sort of stuff. But I think the Frodo, Sam, and Gollum stuff is really, really great.
Yep.
And I think there's reasons behind that. Sort of that the opposite is true almost in the Two Towers because they kind of get sidelined as this other stuff starts to engulf it. So it's a recorrecting of that. And as I said, actually, the Frodo and Sam stuff benefits in that is 1.5 books of plot that the film deals with. So Lord of the Rings fans will know this, but Two Towers actually very famously ends about halfway through the narrative of the Two Towers, at least for Frodo and Sam. All the stuff in The Return of the King, them climbing up the stairs, Shelob the spider, in fact, everything up until the point that that Sam sees Frodo be carried off by the orcs into of that is the climax of the Two Towers in the books. All of that stuff. So there's a lot of stuff for them to do in this movie, and I think it's really important that stuff shines through because it keeps that sense of personable within this massive scale of battle, isn't it? It's a real important moment to take a breath and go back to Frodo and Sam when we're in the middle of hundreds of thousands of orcs fighting hundreds of thousands of people in these big battles, to have a moment of three characters in a small cave bickering really helps, I think.
Yeah, no, I like, and it's a nice partner, presumably, to the sort of this is me butchering, but the idea of the only time that you get those kinds of character studies is actually back in the Shire at the very, very beginning, then presumably a little bit at the end. So it's a nice sort of mirroring of. This is the Shire. This is the kind of conversation, the kind of relationships that one has in the Shire, but it's kind of gone bad. So there's these three of them, and they get progressively the characters themselves and we can talk about the opening of the film as well, but the within that plot line, certainly Sam and Frodo get progressively kind of weathered and beaten and kind of hollowed out, and they become visually more and more like Gollum as the film goes on. And so I really liked that. Just very simple. That's a really great narrative kind of thread. Not that I didn't enjoy all of the other stuff, the spider, the sort of
Yeah, I agree. And to stay on that narrative, actually, what's also helped by that is the complexity of Gollum within all that equation, and there's both a technical and kind of aesthetic or narrative complexity to him. In the Two Towers, Gollum and Smeagol are very much set up as these kind of diametric opposites, right? Smeagol is the innocent, buried beneath this kind of monstrous figure of Gollum, and there's that classic scene in the Two Towers where the two of them have an argument, and Smeagol's saying no, we should be nice, and he's saying no, we should kill him, and that battle is played out. Here, that gets much more murky because Smeagol is the one manipulating Frodo, right? It's Smeagol's childlikeness, his ability to kind of be meek and mild, that means he's manipulating Frodo. So we have that character gets more complicated.
Yeah.
Technically, also, this is probably the first example of a CGI character which looks still like a pretty modern CGI character. Two Towers is pretty good. Here, it's an even bigger step forward in the facial recognition, in the software. I mean, you're going to hopefully, you've got more to say about this than I am because I don't know a lot about it. Yeah. But if you compare these two movies, they're only a year apart. It's noticeably different how much more photorealistic Gollum looks like in Return of the King compared to the Two Towers, and it's really important that character works in this film for reasons we'll get on to as we go through the plot.
No, I've got nothing to say about the tech.
Let's redo the because this is in some ways Gollum's movie, right? I mean, I know we could have said that about the Two Towers, but this literally starts with Gollum, Andy Serkis in close up. So maybe it's time to put Andy Serkis and Gollum in close up and talk about that just for a few minutes. Yeah. I'm not sure we've quite done justice to that in our previous conversation. Yeah. So what's there to say about Gollum that hasn't been said?
Well, first of all, I was surprised. I was surprised that the film did open, and in fact, the film started, and I said, "Andy Serkis. It looks like Andy Serkis," and you went, "It is Andy Serkis." Okay, so I hadn't realised that there was a kind of origin story playing out right at the start of the film, but an origin story that plays out through a character's transition from human to digital. So that's a really interesting thing. So you've got an origin story where a human actor, although he is made up in a kind of slightly grotesque but not completely grotesque way.
Yeah, we see so it's the story of how Smeagol becomes Gollum, how he finds the ring and murders his friend and takes the ring and kind of runs into the mountains, and we see him slowly become digital. Become Gollum.
Becoming digital. So I thought that was an interesting thing for a couple of reasons, because it is a kind of ontological shift from kind of pro-filmic, photographic, human in front of to digital recreation. But also it made me think again about motion capture generally, and around how kind of physical effects are often seen to augment performance. And certainly within these films and the Hobbit films, you get a lot of the kind of prosthetics. Of course you do, prosthetic feet, prosthetic ears, in-camera effects to make Gandalf taller than he is, forced perspective, all the kind of... So visual... in-camera like prosthetics and things like this are used to, and makeup is used to augment a performance, whereas digital makeup is often viewed to hide the performance. And actually that regression, if we can call it that, of Andy Serkis from kind of human Smeagol to kind of digital Gollum is playing with those two poles, that they are both kind of both a character subject to effects. One is practical and sort of fake noses and fake teeth and all this kind of stuff, and then the other is digital. But I like the kind of transition between the two.
I'm interested that you because we've spoken a bit on other episodes about this kind of narrative that is really created at this period of like it's Gollum. It's just like putting on a fake pair of glasses. The kind of Andy Serkis kind of centering of Serkis's performance in the creation of Gollum.
Yes,
and it's and potential problems of that, particularly in terms of just sort of the attribution of labour, right? And I think very much that scene is doing that, right? I mean, the scene, very interesting, just a little kind of bit of trivia, that scene was actually a scene that was meant to be in the Two Towers. They cut it from the Two Towers. There's going to be like a Gollum flashback at one point, and that was going to be the scene that we saw.
Right.
And then they decided to start the Return of the King with it in a kind of like cold prologue-y thing.
Yeah.
I can remember watching that in the cinema, and there were cheers when everyone saw Andy Serkis's face, because by then...
You know who he is.
You know, we'd seen all the DVD extras, we'd seen the making ofs, we've seen the interviews, and he had been associated with this character that was such a kind of beloved part of the Two Towers that's very much people enjoying him being on screen. And it's an attempt to literally kind of go inside Gollum. There is a human, right? There is this, the Smeagol is Serkis. Smeagol is trapped in this kind of exterior that is Gollum, right?
Yeah.
I can see what it's trying to do. I guess the question I'm pushing you to think about is, should it be trying to do that?
Okay, so first of all, I mean, there's lots and lots of things, and actually this is a good film with which to play with somebody these ideas. So first of all, I think, it's obvious, and there's a number of writers that have talked about Andy Serkis is this kind of certainly throughout the 2000s, there are two important figures really that are connected to the development of motion capture. One is the director Robert Zemeckis. So Zemeckis working on A Christmas Carol, Polar Express, Beowulf, and the other is, and probably more importantly, is Andy Serkis. So Tanine Allison has written an article called More Than a Man in a Monkey Suit, which is subtitled Andy Serkis, Motion Capture and Digital Realism. And she says throughout the early 2000s, and I'd say alongside Zemeckis, Serkis, this is a quote, became the public face of motion capture. So he is obviously a really important figure in propelling it as a technique beyond what she calls a kind of novel route to realism and spectacle, but also the idea of kind of performance. So Serkis himself is the face of motion capture as a set of sort of emergent kind of technologies. By that point, probably 2003, I think you're right that the sort of promotion of these films and the sort of I wouldn't say the backlash, but the sort of desire to reclaim the human as the primary control mechanism of motion capture.
Well, they're trying to get away from the Jar Jar Binks problem.
By kind of almost showing the human author of the digital performance, by having that regression play out then on screen, and this is how we went from human to digital. It plays a narrative role, but it also plays a kind of industrial cultural role of, exactly as you said, he is the face of motion capture. There's somebody trapped in. Now I think that trapping is also really, that feeds reflectively into Gollum as a character. So you have the idea of deception and play and split personality. You have that playing out industrially or technologically, because you know the fractured nature of motion capture performance, where one thing gets turned into another. So Gollum is almost like the perfect motion capture character, precisely because that wrestling of identities that he does in this film, and he looks at himself in the water and the conversations that he has with himself, that is kind of reflexively acknowledging these broader debates around who performs the digital image and who performs in motion capture. And we talked about this in the Footnote episode, this sort of myth of authorship. It's very rare, actually. Well, not very rare, but it is rare that the person providing the voice does the movement. It's more common for people to provide movement and someone else to do the voice. There's no reason why they have to be the same thing, unless you really want to push Beowulf, but in even Zemeckis' A Christmas Carol, we talked about this. Tiny Tim, who does the movements, it's not the person who does the voice. There are splits between voice and body. So Serkis is really important, but as I said, that hybridity or that wrestling of identities in the film is something that there's something that plays out actually in the discourses around motion capture. Yeah. So I think that's it. That's an important. This is motion captures certainly in the Hollywood context. 2 or 3 years old. Serkis himself kind of goes on. Not only he does. He's probably best known for people like Gollum, for characters like Gollum, but in the King Kong and the Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and he is the person that's become the face of this technology.
That's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
And surprisingly so. No, very interesting because I struggle actually now, given that it's such a legacy. I'm thinking of all the CGI characters we've had since Gollum. How many of them we could describe as purely kind of good?
A good character would be something like the Polar Express in a film which is all motion capture. But even those characters, because of the fantasy of Christmas, and you don't know whether the kid's kind of dreaming or there's a sort of ethereal quality, it might be that motion capture does work best when it's almost reflexively being used to play with characters who are, there's a kind of meeting point between mocap and morality, as you said. There's a kind of interesting, not quite human, as you said, what's his face, the Thanos problem and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. I don't know. That's an interesting thing. There's a sort of thematic quality. Motion capture is often considered in terms of labour and puppetry and aesthetics and uncanniness and realism and convincing movement. When actually there's a kind of a thematic element. It's monstrous. William Brown writes about this in relation to kind of Beowulf. There's a kind of it's a monstrous technology. So Beowulf, King Kong, Gollum. It's a bit unnerving. It's that tension between the human and the non-human. So that at the level of production, that maybe then plays into some of the ways it is then used thematically on screen. And
to bring it back to Gollum, that sense of, I mean, the character is all about that, right? The sense of the uncanniness of Gollum as a figure. Is he a monster? Is he like Frodo? Is the kind of the kind of dilemma. Yeah. And to the film's credit and to Tolkien's credit, because this is in the source novel, it doesn't ever. Normally, when you get characters who are like, "Oh, are they this or are they that?" it settles it by the end of the movie. I don't, the way the film climaxes, the way the ring is destroyed. Very much leaves that as a there is no that liminality remains there until the very end of until the closing credits, because ultimately what destroys the ring, Frodo and Gollum in the film. In the book, literally what happens in the book is that Gollum bites Frodo's finger off to get the ring back. He dances in victory, trips over and falls into the into the fire.
So it's almost the same in the film.
In the film, they add a bit of agency to Frodo, because it probably would look a bit unsatisfying on screen after 9 hours to just have him accidentally fall into a thing. But crucially, what they don't do is, it's not that Frodo saves the day. Frodo and Gollum are fighting together for the ring, and they both fall off the edge, and Gollum falls with the ring and dies. So basically,
the ring never loses its power.
The ring never loses its power. No one ever destroys the ring on purpose. And ultimately, Frodo and Gollum are the same agent in that. It's just Frodo happens to survive. So that liminality. So is Gollum a force for good or a force for evil?
So that's unresolved.
There's a fun student essay for someone to write.
Or blog.
Yeah. Because ultimately, Gollum, you could argue Gollum is the hero. No, and there are probably, I'm sure, fan blogs out there. You could argue Gollum is the hero of the film. Yeah. Gollum destroys without Gollum, they would not destroy the ring.
No. I was thinking about trust then, because if we're talking about Gollum and motion capture and morality, and how those two things, that Gollum is this perfect display of motion capture's ambivalence, let's say, that the idea of trust,
physical and ontological.
Yeah. And I guess at that point, industrial. How should we take these films? How should we take this technology? So that's a really interesting. So Gollum's like the perfect test case for. And then you get a figure like Serkis, who becomes becoming the face of the technology. There's an idea of trust. When Serkis then appears as Caesar in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, you go, oh, I trust him because of the. So there's a kind of.
Except that's also a character that.
But again, so trust is really important, because and it often mediates. There are writers, Sarah Thomas, who have written about kind of. Stars, and stars are virtual anyway. They are avatars, and so they mediate technological change. I've written about that in terms of de-aging. Like we stars become these counterweights to seismic technological change. They manage it for us. We trust ABBA. We trust whoever who's performing or being digitally manipulated. But trust in this film plays out through that, and that's maybe why I really like that Samwise, Frodo, and Gollum storyline, because it's this kind of little character study between the three of them, and those ideas of trust that play out between the two humans and then the two hobbits and the digital creation is also that level of that idea of trust never really leaves motion capture. How do we classify a lot of writing on motion? How do we classify? How do we write about it? Is it puppetry? Is it true animation? How do we deal with a film like Happy Feet, which we've talked about? Is it something else? all these kinds of things. So trust is an interesting thing that plays out within the film, but it's also a thread that has continued throughout Serkis, motion capture, and all that kind of stuff in the next 20 years.
Interesting. Right. Yes. So
after that short prologue of the film,
let's. I guess we're on this storyline now. So I guess maybe we might take it. Why don't we take it storyline by storyline, if we can make sense of it that way? Is there the Frodo Sam stuff works because of that moral agency? I think we can get on to, because I think that this film also, and Tolkien also, has been quite rightly subjected to a lot of kind of criticism in terms of representation and identity politics, and I think the film is in many ways a very The Lord of the Rings is a very conservative, a very Tory, fantasy. It's a story of the love of countryside, of rural communities, of tradition, of longevity, of it's a very I think Tolkien would probably identify with that. It's not a very capitalistic film, capitalistic story, I should say. It's very anti-industry, it's very anti that kind of thing, but it's very folk story. Where am I going with this? Right, yes. But the Frodo and Sam stuff, I think, provides a nice counterweight to a lot of those things that we might get into when we go back to Minas Tirith and look at all that stuff. But between this, what seems to be quite a blunt battle between good and evil, between white Aragon king savior and big evil orc with a nasty clubfoot, we get a story of moral ambivalence, a story where agency is very shared and interdependent. I said that Gollum could arguably be the hero of the story. Frodo nominally is the hero of the story. That doesn't, of course, Sam.
He's my hero.
As Frodo says, Frodo wouldn't have got very far without Sam. Sam literally carries Frodo into the fires of Mordor. Yeah. And so there's this sense that. There's a sense of collective agency that's going on in that storyline as well, whereby there is no clear hero. Frodo really doesn't do anything other. People talk about everyman characters, as in, but Frodo really is that, in that he doesn't do other. His heroism is a one step in front of the other heroism. It's a heroism of survival. It's a heroism but it's not a heroism of amiable virtue. He's not stronger. He's not braver. He's not able to fight off the ring more than anyone else. He just sort of happens to be the person chosen for this, and happens to manage to put one foot in front of the other all the way to the volcano, and it happens to destroy the ring. But I think all of that's really good. I think all of that's a really murky, interesting story that kind of imitators of Tolkien never really quite do justice to.
Yeah, I was thinking about whether fantasy, because I think you're going back to your point about epic, and the epic quality of it is kind of incredible, really, and that comes from the kind of crowds and the kind of crowd system, and I think that's for me, that's where there's that kind of split. Fantasy films, I don't know whether this is true. Do they often juggle both of those things, or do they lean more towards? I feel like they lean more towards the sort of massive displays of spectacle and the fights. And I like the fact that there is space that the film carves out for both of those narratives simultaneously. But having said all of that, I also really like the spectacle of these huge sequences where you have this kind of crowd software, and actually it's AI software. It's programs like Massive or Denizen, I think it's Massive in this case, that artificially create these moving swarms of. Yeah.
So for the listeners' benefit, we seem to be moving on to the battles now. What is Massive, for those who don't know? I mean, we don't have to go over it too much. I think it's been quite well covered in the kind of literature and DVDs of this film. But just talk us through.
Don't watch those things. Listen to it. Sure. So Massive is first of all, there are a number of programs that are specifically intended to generate huge kind of crowds. So rather than sort of animate individual agents within a crowd, you can use particular kinds of software to copy paste, let's say, and create these huge armies and swarms. So I've been really interested in this because a lot of computer animated films, right from the start two, actually, community animated films released in Hollywood, numbers 2 and 3, Ants and A Bug's Life, are both about colonies and both about a large number of insects doing cool things cohesively. And actually, a lot of these films are about the rogue agent within the colony. So Flick in A Bug's Life, or Z in Ants.
Okay.
This is the dance that we all do, but I'm going to do something different. Remy in Ratatouille. Rats do this, but I'll do something different that's different to the Barry B. Benson in Bee Movie. Bees do this, but what happens if we go? So it's sort of, there's an interesting way of, there's a kind of political charge to the use of crowd. Anyway, Massive is this program that was first built by a guy called Stephen Regulus for Weta, so Weta Digital, so Peter Jackson.
And you're right to say that, yes, Massive is a really important bit of software that is invented for these movies, but actually, like, there are lots of different versions of this kind of software. And this
Denizen is another one.
Yeah. We literally, Gladiator was probably the first example of the big crowds, the Colosseum, to life and things like that. And I don't know what software they use, but like, this is the era in which big crowds are born on screen, in the way that a fantasy film made in the 1980s, the big battle between thousands of orcs and thousands of men would be happening just off screen, and there'd be 3 extras in the thing. Here we can actually see the army, and that's a sort of digital innovation of this era.
Well, it's funny because in, what is it, Phantom Menace. So Phantom Menace, the pod race in Phantom Menace.
Sure.
So that film is started production in 97, but released in 99.
Yep.
Their crowds are
yes, I didn't think of that, but
cotton
yes,
buds
right.
dipped in paint.
Oh, really?
They're not digital. They're cotton buds dipped in paint, and you can see lots of behind-the-scenes footage of all these little lines of. And then you get, a year later, you get the Colosseum, and
Gladiator.
I can't.
And then a year after that, we get the first Lord of the Rings movie. So,
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to quickly, in real time, Gladiator film crowd system. For all these shots, Mill Film provided 70,000 computer-generated performers that gesticulated, milled about, and populated the Colosseum. So Mill Film, whoever they are, their software. Anyway, so you have a number of different. So Denizen is one, and Massive is another. There are other crowd systems are available.
And this is what I meant about the film being influential, probably the most influential visually.
Yeah.
Because I think this is the thing that, like, we're sort of really in 2024 just coming to the end of, in that kind of the spectacle of crowd violence.
Yeah.
It has become, it got quickly swallowed up by Marvel.
The crass ornament.
Huh?
The crass ornament.
Very good, very good. Yes, it got quickly swallowed up by Marvel, and that's the common thing about Marvel, isn't it? Is that its final descends into crowds fighting other crowds.
Yes.
And perhaps the kind of backlash against the superhero movies, in part a backlash against that kind of spectacle. So I'd be interested in what we do next after that. But it wasn't born in Iron Man. It was born probably a little bit in Helm's Deep, the Two Towers climax. But really, it's this film that has these kind of huge crowd-based spectacles of warfare.
Yeah. So I'm all very excited now about crowds.
Lovely.
For a couple of reasons. I think one, writers within visual effects talk exactly about this phase of kind of early 2000s into I guess it's the Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to think of other kind of crowd heavy films. I think probably WALL-E's a good example from 2008. I've written a bit about that. Happy Feet, the kind of swarms of Anyway, so crowd systems. There are Kristen Vissel's in her book talks about the digital multitude, which I can't remember if I would have mentioned on this podcast, which is kind of exactly talking about this kind of spectacle of crowds, digitally enabled crowds, and also kind of tracing it back to the mass ornament and Sigrid Krakauer writing about kind of cohesiveness. And I think, you could link that to the Hollywood musical, to go back to my first reference point of the podcast, thinking about, the kind of power of the spectacle and the kind of the politics of the uniform group. More recently, Erica Balsam from King's has written an article called The Crowd is Dead, Long Live the Crowd, and I've been thinking about in relation to the politics of recent crowds, not only in the terms of pandemic and the tide of kind of gatherings, but also if you think about the doctoring of inauguration photographs and the crowds, the difference between very famously the difference between the kind of Trump crowd and the Obama crowd, and the role of digital effects in thinking about, well, actually, crowds are.
Can I throw in a 30? I'm
do
sure
it.
You've already thought.
No, do it.
Just jump on the bandwagon. You mean use the word swarm
right.
when you were describing the massive software. There's also the politics of that kind of crowd, the crowds of, in terms of mass migration, the crowds of people. I guess my point is that is there? We talked with Gollum about the kind of the fusing of the political with the technological.
Yeah,
is part of the thing about this software is it has a dehumanizing. In the same way that the mass ornament did, right?
Yeah.
Is it has it's a spectacle in dehumanized agents, dehumanized bodies forming a mass, either in terms of, in this film, either a threatening mass or a heroic, valoric mass.
Yeah.
But there's something inherent to the program that creates. That copies and multiplies and things like that. It's a rhetoric and a technology of dehumanization.
Yes, that's
throwing that out.
No, I think that's right. If you think about the way that like the woke blob are used, and the way that migrants are talked about, a swarm of migrants arriving on our shores, using the language of migration to talk about a disease. These aren't deliberate, Turns out politicians know what I wouldn't say know what they're talking about, but they talk very deliberately. And so I think the the crowd, certainly as a kind of quote unquote post-COVID, and Erica talks a little bit about this in her article, returning to the cinema as a space of crowds at the end of, so this is August, from I think last year, a couple of years ago, end of August, after months of suffering with the small screen, the first two films I saw began with crowd scenes. So Les Miserables and then Tenet is our other example. But the idea of kind of a history of crowd scenes in films, that now we can create. The epic is now done on the screen, and you can create all these little, like, using computer programs. But I think there is a kind of real, as writers like Erica and Krakauer as well, who are making these, thinking about films that use crowd scenes and crowds politically. There is an interesting, vexed, ambivalent place about the role of the individual and the kind of the dehumanizing of an individual within a broader swarm or collective, and how you find your place within. I don't know. There's something. Because that's what we do. That's how we are at the moment. We're kind of trying to find your place. You're trying to move through a world that isn't built for them. But you're part of communities, or you're part of crowds, and people reintegrating into crowds and learning how to be part of a crowd again.
So to bring it back to Return of the King, I asked the question because I think that when we get onto the narrative of the Battle of Pellamore Fields, the bit where they fight the orcs for you. That's where a lot of criticism has been levied at the movies, which, has been levied at Tolkien about this it's basically a white patriarchal fantasy of colonization. The orcs are this kind of other race, evil incarnate that white men need to defeat. And then the way that is rendered in these sequences has attracted certain critiques. I'm thinking because the orcs become a swarm quite literally through the way you're describing, in the way that Aragorn never does, or at least the character,
he retains his individuality.
Gotcha. And also just sort of other little fig leaves on the top of that, or no, not fig leaves. Furnishes on the top of that I know, for example, Francis Pheasant Kelly, who's been a friend of the show, has talked a lot about kind of the sequence in the movie where we have the arrival of this sort of exotic force from the east, and we see these kind of elephant riders emerge out of the distance. An Orientalist kind of aesthetic suddenly parades over the film, and cloaked in this kind of paraphernalia of a kind of Pan-Asian, in a post 9/11 context, and talking about the way in which this dynamic is rendered creates or draws from social tensions that are not necessarily helpful to indulge, shall we say. I'm not persuaded by that reading, but I think it's one worth talking through. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, I get, the crude question is like, is what we're watching some sort of white supremacist power fantasy playing out, where those that dare to be other, those that dare to be not physically, orcs are ugly, evil, incarnate, disabled, ephemerate sometimes. They're basically kind of this kind of litmus or test of like everything that's socially othered.
Yes, absolutely.
On screen.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
That's really interesting, and I like the idea that there's a sort of the technology is doing some of this kind of heavily, or at least opens up a reading of thinking about the kinds of characters that are copy pasted, or the kinds of characters that are duplicated and are made to be part of swarms, versus there's no one quite like. There's kind of gradations of you have your big swarms, you have your community. Your hobbits aren't swarms, but they're communities.
I'm reminded, for example, of like the bit where there's a whole subplot involving the army of the dead, which we don't have to get into unless you want to, because I don't find it very satisfying.
Cool green,
ghosty things.
Parts of the Caribbean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's a scene where our three heroes, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, all run at some orcs, and then this swarm of ghosts come out and sort of destroy all the orcs and things like that. But the scene works to kind of punctuate the three individuals in the scene, and then as the battle plays on, we get Legolas defeat an elephant, and we get all these kind of moments of individual heroism mixed with these just shots of swarms fighting one another.
Yeah. No, I think there's a kind of the politics of the crowd, the politics of the crowd, of course, that people like Erica would kind of talk about, and even she talked about kind of football crowds. During COVID, you weren't allowed to have crowd, but then there were simulating crowds by playing. You could listen to a soundtrack over television and stuff. So the crowd is obviously really important to kind of spectacle and belonging and stuff. And I think you're right, in this film there is something political happening in terms of the characters that remain individual versus the quote unquote type of character that is made that retains their individuality and is the leader or part of a team but never a swarm, and their exceptionalism versus the swarms and the hordes and the kinds of technologically created masses that Kristen Vissel's writing about in her book. The racial and the ableist narratives that support or play with that as a conflict between different kinds of bodies.
And just to really push this to the extreme,
Let's do it.
I'll happily mount the counter argument, which is one I probably agree with more, if I'm very honest. But I take it seriously enough to think it should be voiced.
Yeah.
Tolkien comes out of a miasma of different cultural influences around the sort of turn of the 20th century that, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, that in other contexts have been the breeding ground for kind of fascist movements. I'm not saying Tolkien is part of that in any way, shape or form. That should be very clear. But if you read social histories of Britain, of Europe, of Germany in the early 20s, some of the things that gave birth to kind of to fascism across Europe are things like a growing interest in medieval society, a romanticism for the past, a pleasure and a sort of desire, a turn for it, a glamorization of authoritarianism. Tolkien was pretty ambivalent on democracy, for example. His Return of the King isn't completely figurative in this movie. I'm not. He wasn't an anti-democrat, but he's certainly a conservative figure.
Yeah.
So all of these things are in the novel and in other worlds, and this is 1880s. We get Ivanhoe. 20th century, we get kind of this kind of massive love of medieval culture, and this all kind of I guess I'm saying that there are in other people in other contexts the same set of interests that inspired Tolkien to create a magical land inspired others to try to create other worlds on Earth. with much more devastating and horrible consequences.
Yeah. No, I think that's a
Then a story of some hobbits in a ring.
Yes. No. I think there's and
so yes, I'm just trying to highlight there are real world consequences when some of these things are taken up by the wrong people, I guess.
Yeah.
You know.
No, the only thing I'll throw in there is I was thinking about when you mentioned the kind of Orientalism and Fran's work on this kind of exotic force. There's a book. I must admit, I have not read it, but I know of it, called Techno-Orientalism, which is about the imagining Asia in speculative fiction, history, and media. And I was thinking about the kind of collision between, and also going to throw in the word the Transformers, but kind of the collision between technological forces and othering and otherness, all this kind of stuff, and who has access to humanity and all these kinds of things. So I don't really have anything else to add other than I know you've written about this, like the kind of the racial dynamics of the way that the films construct their communities and the difference between the way, at a very basic representation 101, the difference between the way the Shire is presenting the kinds of bodies that inhabit the Shire versus the kind of grotesque and clearly kind of racial undertones of some of the character designs in some of these movies, and the voice work as well. I don't really have anything to add other than there's a clear division happening there that is painted very light and dark in interesting ways, and that's all I have really to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I always say the counter argument in that is that fantasy is all about the kind of pleasure of liminality, and it's about using these vessels to do something imaginative with as a spectator. I think any embodiment of evil will have a social component to it, no matter when you create that embodiment of evil, and it will involve pernicious and pervasive stereotypes that exist in a culture by which you create it. So there's no doubt in my mind that when Tolkien came up with the orcs, he was drawing on some unconscious biases towards figures of, I don't want to start naming lots and lots of different things he could have been doing, but I don't doubt that happened. What I would like to celebrate or spend more energy thinking about is that, but because they function as figures of fantasy, that's not often how they're used by the spectator. So Tolkien created a Tory fantasy of lost England, and in the 1960s and 70s, hippies used it as an expression of counterculturalism. That's just a small example of the way in which a fantasy can be used by its consumer in ways that don't really matter in terms of who created it. I'm sure that's true of all art, but I think there's something liminal about fantasy that mean figures of evil and figures of good can be warped and made more malleable than perhaps the more representational modes of fiction.
Yeah, and it also makes me think of the episode that we did when we did Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when we were talking about the difference between kind of mudbloods and muggles and things, and thinking about difference and going, it's about kind of racial difference, isn't it? And Jyotsna, our guest, was like, well, actually, they are both those divisions between mudblood and muggle they're both racialized categories of identity, but also they're emptied entirely of racial consciousness, and actually they have nothing to do with race insofar. There are more readings available just because we live in a world where disparity and difference often plays out through race and ethnicity. And that's how we often recognize. That's a shorthand to identifying difference. That doesn't necessarily mean that every example of difference in movies must therefore be allegorically about race.
No,
if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense.
So she was talking when we. I think I remember us kind of going, it's kind of an allegory for race and mudbloods, and she was like, well, actually, no, it's kind of a lot more complex than that because of their status, because of maybe the role of fantasy, that there's an emptying out of racial consciousness that allows us, and I'm reminded of work on the cyborg as well, that the cyborg is this liminal in-between figure between the human and the non-human, and Donna Haraway very famously said that that it's a creature of science fiction as well as social reality, and thinking about all different kinds of in-between bodies, let's say, from kind of trans bodies, queer bodies, mixed race, people writing about the kind of mulatto cyborg, and the way that the cyborg it's not just about race, but it kind of has all these different identities and ways of thinking about difference. And what's really great about the cyborg is that it becomes perhaps usefully available for us to talk in these kind of symbolic terms. But it reminded me that it maybe is we don't necessarily need to jump too quickly into the The difference between these two is clearly unfolds along the fault lines of race when there's something else by virtue of its fantasy that allows for different kinds of readings.
A quote from Tolkien, because hey, why not?
Well, he's not here, is he? No.
He wrote a preface to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, and in that his books had sort of been widely interpreted by lots and lots of literary critics, and one of the things it had been interpreted at was a sort of allegory of the Second World War, which it kind of functions as, or nuclear war. There, the ring as the nuclear bomb, all these kind of different ways of reading the film.
Cool.
And he said, in response to the suggestions that the Lord of the Rings functions as all these different allegories, the answer is that it doesn't. Very bombastic Tolkien kind of manner. It isn't an allegory, and this is the quote: "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done since I grew old enough and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, truth or feigned."
So he's saying that there's so they're not allegories of...
These are feigned histories.
Okay.
For which the reader...
Not allegories of history. Okay.
On that note,
I'm not going to...
Well, I guess what I would say is that I think we can allow the film to be complicated. We can allow our experience of the film to be complicated enough whereby two things can be true at the same time. The orcs are racialized, and they are drawing on pernicious stereotypes of race. Whether every single one of us has to worry about that is a really big question with lots and lots of different answers.
Yeah, and actually I think that's...
and says a lot about... And I don't mean this in a derogatory way. That will depend on who the readers are and the viewers are as much as it will on what the hell is going on the screen.
Yeah. Well,
and when they're being watched, I guess, as well. What
is critical thinking, if not always holding two contradictory things?
Sure.
And also that the films... And maybe my question to you is...
Sorry, just on that point, because that's really important. I think that's the point, is that fantasy isn't about that. Like I'm talking about fantasy, PH as an imaginative impulse. Imagination doesn't function with that level of complexity, right? Thought does. Thought can hold two contradictory impulses at once, but a child's fantasy makes things good or bad, right? So if a film engages with the imagination, it does play with a logic of good and bad, of good versus evil. What a thinking human being does with those imaginative impulses is a massively complicated question. So because the logic of fantasy functions on screen like this does not mean the logic of fantasy functions off screen.
So the logic of fantasy with an F on screen doesn't mean that the logic of fantasy PH.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes.
You should write a book about that.
Sure. Did Encounter of the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema. I can't even remember the name of it, but it's that. Find it. Yeah. And there's a lovely chapter on All the Rings where I talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah. Okay. No.
Shall we? Yeah. Go on. No. Do you have anything more to say about the kind of politics of the crowd?
Only insofar as what I really liked about this film was how the crowd, because you can't have a crowd. A crowd needs to fill space, and actually that's why I also liked about this film. I thought there was some really interesting... there's really extreme... Yes, there is kind of canted angles and lots of low-angled shots and things, but I thought what this film... the use of the crowds, and maybe the contrast between the crowd systems and the three... Gollum, Sam and Frodo, and having that as two dual narratives, let's say... That drew attention to what I found quite stark and dramatic contrasts between vertical space and landscape. There's lots of very wide and there's lots of very tall. And Kristen, who I've mentioned already, has written in her book where she talks about the digital multitude, digital effects cinema. She talks about the new verticality and kind of vertical space in, I guess, Hollywood action films, but the idea that it has been, of course, there's a new visual logic that's been ushered in by digital technology and video games and virtual reality. But she talks about a new verticality of action cinema. If we think about commanding heights and kind of sweeps and scenes of like descent and ascent, and the crowds really allow for that to be maximized because crowds stretch across, and they are punctuated in the film by really tall. I can't remember that you mentioned it earlier. The name of the place, the city,
Minas Tirith.
That's the one. Yeah. Bless you. That one. That's very, very tall, and they don't film it. They don't film it in a way that you are never going to forget its tallness or its height. And so I quite like some of the expressive camera work that is really thinking about verticality, of gravity, as Kristen says, and gravity and force and power. And so I really like that. The kind of the use of the crowds drew attention to the way that the film uses space quite dramatically, both in its kind of horizontal landscape form and the expanse of the New Zealand on location kind of shooting, and this kind of what Vissel calls this new verticality of action cinema, where action is really happening at the it's happening on all floors of Nakatomi Tower.
Sure. And the camera makes so much of a virtue of this, and there's lots of sweeping shots and down.
Love that. I love a virtual camera.
Jackson's very good at injecting that kind of sense of the physical into all these big sweeping vistas. I must say, he's very good at that. That actually comes across in a slightly more intimate manner in the spider Shelob sequence that you mentioned at the beginning. Right? That's a very virtuoso use of camera.
That is my.
People often say quite bluntly, it's sort of it's the horror maker of Jackson coming back into the fore, and to an extent that is true. But it's certainly a sequence where he is allowed to direct, and he takes up the opportunity, right?
Because that's actually why I wrote extreme Canton angle. I think it's when the spider's stalking, and then finally captures for there's kind of this dizzying perspective. And your sense of geography is kind of all over the place, really. And the camera kind of moves, and you go from almost looking directly up with a bit of Frodo in the bottom right. So I thought that was really cool. And in a film where a lot of this stuff can kind of get lost. And it made me think whether the two narrative strands are also kind of stylistically different as well. I didn't pay much attention to that, but my sense is that could partially be true, or whether there's a bit of bleeding between.
Sure.
Anyway, I don't know. Vertical space, great.
Interesting. We've been going for probably about an hour, and there's so much more I could say, and I don't want to turn this into a podcast that has the same epic quality as the film we're talking about. But it'd be a shame not to cover some of it.
Go for it.
Go on. Opportunity. Well, let's just stay on, because we talked a lot about that. The kind of the Return of the King plot, if you will, of Aragorn returning to the throne of Gondor, of these big battle sequences. Essentially two battles, isn't there? For most of the film, there's the battle of what's known as the Battle of Pelennor Fields by Tolkien fans, but basically a big siege of Minas Tirith, and then there's a final battle. At the climax of the movie, which essentially serves as a decoy for Frodo and Sam to get to Mount Doom and destroy the ring. So essentially two big battles in this movie. I would like to just highlight, for no other reason than I'd like to do it, some of the quieter moments in those big battles, because I think there is a lot of battling, and I would cut quite a bit of it out if I were an editor, and perhaps that's why I'm not an editor. But I think that's where the film gets quite flabby and quite banal, actually, is where there's an orc throwing a cave troll at a dragon, and the perspective.
I've just seen one, you've seen them all.
But there are some really lovely quieter moments in that battle sequence that I'd like to just tick off.
Let's dwell on them.
I love the bit. I love the failed attack on Osgiliath. So the kind of the siege. Yeah, Chris is looking at me like he's about to have a stroke. The sort of where so we have this steward king who's sort of despairing against the world, and when he hears the orcs are attacking, he sends his riders out to try to retake a fallen outpost, a kind of fortress bit, and he sends basically his son and a group of soldiers, and everyone's saying don't do it, sends him off to death, and you get these soldiers running in vain at the orcs with Pippin, played by Billy Boyle, singing this kind of lullaby ballads.
Yes.
And it intersperses three things. It intersperses him singing this really quiet, elegiac song, the death of these men as they're sort of needlessly fired down by orcs. And you get Denethor, the steward king, eating a roast chicken and tomato in the most grotesque way possible. And that's some very good filmmaking, because it's very visceral, it's very melancholic at the same time, it's bloody but it's never bloodied on screen, it's deathly but there's no death on the screen necessarily. There's all these different bodily registers going on, and it communicates a kind of, I said this is a Tory fantasy. It's a Tory fantasy fused with a lot of post-war meditation, and this is very much the kind of Battle of the Somme esque moment almost, isn't it? Soldiers being sent out to death and generals sitting back eating roast chicken and watching on.
Yeah. Yes,
I think it's a really, really nuanced but really lovely moment. Lovely in a kind of, sad sense.
Isn't there there's that line in one of the Blackadder Goes Forth episodes where Haig says something like, "We'll be right behind you," and Blackadder says, "Yes, about 400 miles."
Yes.
So there's that quality to it, and the kind of quick cutting between.
And Tolkien served in the war, and a lot of this is a kind of reflection on war, and anyway, so yeah.
I'm trying to. Yeah, I guess it's often difficult maybe when you have films where, and maybe this is the benefit of it being the third film of the trilogy, where a lot of these characters are not blood relations; they have been thrown together,
thrown together in fellowship,
exactly,
as they would say.
But there are these moments of family with the character that you just said, the
Denethor.
Yes, him, Denethor, the one who's kind of this kind of corrupt. He's not the king, is he? He's the guy who pretends to be the king.
That feels like a character that needs a bit more space to be done justice to. It's a pretty weird caricature of a thing.
Because then he has a sort of mental breakdown and tries to sort of commit suicide.
And that's kind of almost laughable, that sequence.
While also killing his son, who has been told on numerous occasions, in fact, still alive. And then the other one you're going to have to... Where the... oh goodness me!
You just need to remember one thing, and I'll get you there. But you have to remember something.
The killing. I'm not a man. I'm a woman.
Oh, Eowyn. Yeah. Killing
that
the Witch King of or whatever his name is. Yeah.
I promise, listeners, I did watch the film.
Yes, you did. But for God's sake, even I can't remember most of the characters.
A lot's going on. But I love Bernard Hill anyway. Who doesn't love Bernard Hill?
Sure.
And so his death, his daughter.
Yeah, that's a lovely little.
That's that moment of quiet, which is kind of telegraphed because clearly that will happen. That's clearly going to. But it's done so well. Yeah, it's done so well. And actually, I did think towards the end, I thought, God, this film, if this film is 20 years old, it feels great, it looks great, the effects look brilliant. Mm-hmm. So it could have been made last year. This year looks
my
fab.
two other quiet moments, if you'll indulge me, are when Gandalf So Gandalf and Pippin are kind of being sieged.
I know who they are.
The orcs seem to be threatening to take over, and Pippin's like, "This is it. We're going to die."
I didn't think we'd end like this.
Oh no, we won't. And he kind of paints a picture of heaven, basically, right? He says, "Well, no, we won't die. What we'll do is we'll be killed here, and then
death is the journey."
He gives this kind
else.
of description. It's actually taken from the final few paragraphs of the novel, where they do reach this. In Tolkien mythology, you can travel to heaven by boat. In fact, that's literally what Frodo does at the end of the movie. And that's something like white shores, crisp sand, and a far off sunrise, or something like that.
So did Frodo maybe die? Is that all a dream at the end?
Well, he's sort of dead. He is died. He does die. He dies. He sort of commits euthanasia at the end of the film.
Right.
You're looking at me like, do I care about it?
No. But
when they sail off in that boat with the elves, that's them going to what's called the Undying Lands, which is basically a kind of a heaven.
Okay.
The elves go to heaven and take Gandalf, who sort of is an angel, and Frodo with them.
Okay, okay. I just thought they were.
Tolkien's a Roman Catholic. Right?
I didn't quite know what was happening there. I must admit. Where
I mean, he leaves is all you really need to know. But those versed in Tolkien lore will know that is what happens. He's going to the place that Gandalf describes to Pippin in that moment.
Because according to the interweb, I hadn't realised that after the hobbits return home from the Shire and Sam marries Rosie, that there's 4 years passed.
Yes.
There's
a line where he says something like, 4 years have passed since Weathertop.
So he's still, because I said to you, I was thinking about these moments of quiet, the side of the pain that he is still under. The fact he looks horrendous at the end of the film, like he's obviously got some sort of trauma, and he's working through the events of. He's probably watched all 3 films.
Again, post-war kind of meditation. Like,
Absolutely, he's the returning male veteran.
Yeah, him and Sam are like there's that line, there's that bit. It's a pretty cheesy Wizard of Oz. I got the Wizard of Oz in. The wake up scene where Frodo wakes up in bed.
Yes,
and it's Gandalf, and then they all kind of run in. It's a bit like, and you were there, and you were there, and you're there too, kind of.
I mean, I thought he'd already died. I thought that was he died then and there.
Too many endings, man. Anyway, and there's that lovely little, but in that quite cheesy scene, there's that bit where Sam comes in at the end, right, and Frodo looks at Sam, and Sam looks at him, and there's a look of like, we might not speak ever about what we just did, but there's a bond that these people don't share. I think that's a very kind of Tolkien back from war-esque look. Yeah,
because I then thought, so they depart Middle-earth for the Undying Lands.
Yeah.
I understand that. And we can talk about this off air. This is not
you don't need to understand it. My point was about that moment. It's a beautiful bit of it's a bit of lovely description by Tolkien, and it's nice that they got it into the movies, and it's quite nice that I like that little scene, and that Gandalf kind of provides this moment. It's just quiet little character moments within this big spectacle that the films do have. Even this film in all its imperfections, and I think it's a good movie, but I don't think it's as good as the others. The others balance it better, but they still have these kind of moments of character that are really, really important.
In terms of that trauma, then, so when Sam, because it's interesting then, if it's interesting that the film begins with Andy Serkis in human form and the origin story of Smeagol, it's also interesting, and we talked a bit off air about who's the protagonist and as well a minute ago. But so Sam, the film ends with Sam's return to the Shire. He even says, I'm back.
That's the last line of the film,
is also one of the most unconvincing I'm back, because you think, well, actually, as you say, he's gone through some things with Frodo, and there is a trauma here that is not shell shock that he is not going to get himself. So I found the ending ending interesting for 2 reasons. One, I finally made the link between the rings and the Hobbit doors.
Sure.
I was like, oh my God, they're rings as well.
Yeah.
And also the ending with Sam and the sort of his family and his children, that felt quite hollow as well, because I thought there are some things that have gone on
in a good way, right?
Well,
I don't know. Actually, maybe that's it. Because obviously we should get onto this now. It's the whole too many endings criticism of Return of the King.
No, I guess if he's gone through all of this stuff with Frodo, and there is that shared look of the bond that the two of them have shared that the others will never know. And Gandalf probably has an idea of, and Gandalf then takes Frodo. I didn't read that as to death. I just read that as he's off, but fine.
Yeah.
He's dead. Then you've got Sam, who is quite fragile, I thought. And when he said, "I'm back," I was like, "I'm not sure
you are.
You're not sure you are." Anyway, that was my.
No, well, I think that is. I think again, like the copies of Tolkien and their endless numbers that have come since, and I love a lot of them. Willow's a lovely copy of Tolkien, but those films always end with "I'm back now, but let's have a party," as if all of that. And what I think is that I think the final 15 minutes does test everyone's patience, because it's been a long movie and there are some not very well executed moments in it, but I think it's trying to communicate something that I think is really worth communicating, which is that there is no go, that that it's that kind of it's the film doesn't end triumphantly, it ends tragically.
Yes, absolutely.
Frodo, there's a few just small little lines, and Frodo says we set out to save the Shire, and we did save the Shire, but not for me. As if, we set out to save this little patch of innocence, and we have saved it, but I can no longer.
At what cost?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's good. I think that's because again, talking about morality, there's an interesting question it asks of like, well, should Frodo have ever gone, because he was never going to save the Shire, because by going he doomed himself.
There's a lot of that kind of language in the film, but the journey home, I don't think there is going to be one.
Yeah, I don't think
there's a lot of that.
One. And I think that's a really I think it's really nuanced and rich, because I think it asks questions of, I think the answer is he still should have gone, I think is what the film is saying.
Yeah.
But it's tragic he had to.
Yeah.
And I think, again, post-war meditation. I won't say it anymore, but I think that's a great bit. Very quickly, love the bit where they're lying on Mount Doom, Frodo and Sam, and I think they're about to be engulfed by lava. Oh no, it's just before they go and destroy the ring, and he's saying, "Can you remember the taste of strawberries? Can you remember the taste of strawberries and the sound of And there's that little kind of whistle on the Frodo kind of Hobbit theme. You can just hear it in the background of this kind of doom-laden soundtrack, and I think Howard Shore's score is really effective in that moment.
Yeah. And then that's partnered with, you're right, that there's that scene, Can You Remember, and then where they think they're about to be engulfed with lava, and then he says, "I can now remember.
Yeah, I can see the Shire. And it's obviously like the first time he's thought about it for ages, and
brilliant. No, I thought.
Do you have any more bits, or should we call that?
No, I mean, I did think the kind of that part, the Paths of the Dead, those kind of ghostly apparitions. I thought that was quite fun because I just wasn't. I mean, it's obviously digital effects heavy, but I just thought, I wasn't expecting that as a. We also haven't really talked about the color. The colours of these films. This one's very green. Mm-hmm. There's lots of green and then towards the end bright orange. I don't know. I would have to rewatch them again if I've got a spare couple of years. I'll rewatch.
And yellow, actually, like the yellow of the ring really burns. The yellow of the ring and the yellow of Sauron. I think actually very quickly we talked about orcs. Evil equals. Ugliness equals evil is kind of the phantasmic with the pH equation that the film offers, right? The kind of fantasy logic of evil equals ugliness. But there's a counterbalance to that, which is a similar act, which is the beauty of the ring is evil.
Yes,
that
can't look away.
It's so beautiful that it's evil, right? So there's a similar counterbalancing phantasmical thing going on there as well.
Perfect.
Wow. Well, I almost feel like we're returning to the Shire after all that podcasting, Chris. I mean, I'm glad you came through it with me. I'm sorry to have dragged you too much into sword and sorcery, but I think these movies were a really important shaping of my own academic identity. I don't think I wasn't just these movies, but I was at the right age at the right time for these movies to come along, and it's been fun to. I mean, I've written about them before and things, but it's been fun to revisit them with you and talk through. Particularly this one. I haven't seen this one quite as much as the others.
I really liked it.
Yeah, good. For those who've not seen, why on earth are you still listening? But for those who've not seen them for a while, I should say, they're worth a revisit. They're worth a rewatch because there are bits in this movie that feel like the cliche that people think these films are, but actually they're, as hopefully we've picked through in all these episodes, there's lots more nuance and interest and richness between all the hobbits and the wizards and the trolls.
Yes.
Cool. All right.
Yes.
If you have any more thoughts on the Lord of the Rings, those are ours.
Yes.
But if you have any more, you can, of course, suggest a blog post or write to us asking for a footnote episode at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. You can find the list of our archive, you can find the archive of our blog and podcast on our website, fantasy-animation.org, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on all social media platforms with the same handle, FANANIM Research, FANANIM Research. And I think that's probably enough plugging. So we'll see you next time in another world of fantasy and animation.
Bye.